Picture a clock, made of bronze, sitting at the bottom of the sea. Picture it there for 2,000 years. The salt eating into the gears, the wood of its case rotting away, the dials seizing, the sea pressing in on all sides. And then, one morning, in a storm, in October of the year 1900, a sponge diver is lowered down through the dark water above it. Tonight, you are going to meet him. His name is Elias Stadiatis. You should hold the name, Stadiatis. You may never have heard it before, and you may never hear it again, but he is the man whose hands, in a few minutes, are going to touch a thing that you, and everyone you know, and everyone they know, has been told for 100 years was impossible. He is from the small Greek island of Symi, in the Dodecanese, near the coast of what is now Turkey. He is a sponge diver. That is the trade his father taught him, and his father's father before that. The men of Symi have been going down to the seabed for sponges since long before anyone was writing it down. They go down on a single breath, sometimes. They go down in copper helmets and canvas suits, sometimes, when they can afford the rigs. They come up with sponges, and with stories. Most of the stories are dull. The seafloor, mostly, is a dull place. Rocks, weed, the bones of fish, sand. But this morning, this October morning in 1900, the story is going to be different. You should know how they got there. Captain Dimitrios Kondos was leading a small fleet of sponge boats home from the coast of North Africa, from the waters off Tunisia, where they had been working through the warm months. They were sailing back to Symi for the winter. They were tired. They had a good catch in the holds. They wanted to be home. And then the wind turned. The wind turned, and the sea began to rise, and the small fleet had to look for shelter. They found it on the lee side of a tiny island called Antikythera. You have probably never heard of it. It is a flake of rock between Crete and the Peloponnese, in the channel where the Aegean and the Ionian seas meet. It has a few sheep on it. It has a few families on it. It has nothing else. You could walk across the whole island, end to end, in an afternoon. The fleet anchored in the lee of Antikythera, and they waited for the storm to pass. And while they waited, Kondos, who was practical and who was the captain, decided his men should not be idle. He told them to put on the suits and go down. There might be sponges, he said. There might be something. The men grumbled. The sea was rough. The depth was steep. But they did as the captain told them. They always did. Elias Stadiatis was the one who went first. You should try to picture the gear they wore. It is not the gear of a modern diver. It is a thing made of canvas and rubber and bolted brass. A copper helmet sits on the shoulders, and the helmet is heavy enough on its own to break your neck if you fall wrong. The helmet has small round windows. The air comes down a hose from a hand pump on the deck above. If the men at the pump get tired, or distracted, or scared, the air slows. If the hose tangles on the rocks, the air stops. If the diver goes too deep or comes up too fast, the air in his blood, begins to bubble. The men of Symi knew about the bubbles. They had a name for it. They had buried friends from it, but they went down anyway. That was the trade. Stadiatis went down through the cold water, off the eastern edge of the island, in a place where the seabed sloped steeply away into the dark. The water was clear, where it was not stirred up by the storm. The light from above was grey. He sank slowly. The pressure built around the canvas and the copper. He could hear the air hissing in. He could hear his own breathing. He could hear the small, dim sound of the rope creaking against the gunwale of the boat above him. And then, at about 50 meters down, his feet touched the bottom. You should try to be there with him for a moment. You should feel the weight of the helmet. You should hear your own breathing inside the brass. You should feel the cold of the water through the canvas, around your wrists, around your ankles, at the small of your back where the suit does not quite fit. You should feel the slope of the seabed under your boots, slick with sediment, slipping a little when you set your weight down. 50 meters is deep. 50 meters in 1900, in a canvas suit with a copper helmet and a hand pump, is dangerously deep, but it is where the bottom was. So he stood there, and he looked around, and then he started running. He started running, as best a man can run on the seabed, in a heavy suit, with a hose tugging at his back. He started running for the rope. He was banging on his helmet. He was waving his arms. He wanted to come up on the boat. The men hauled him in as fast as they could without killing him. Too fast, and the bubbles would get into his blood. Too slow, and he would burst with whatever it was that he had seen. They hauled. They watched the surface. They waited. When his helmet came clear of the water, he was babbling. He was babbling about horses. He was babbling about naked men. He was babbling about a heap of corpses on the seabed. Captain Kondos, who was a practical man, slapped him gently and told him to slow down. Stadiatis, when he could speak, said it again. Bodies, horses, people, a whole heap of them down there, in the dark. He thought he had found a graveyard. He thought, perhaps, the dead had come walking back into the sea. Kondos did not believe him, or, rather, he believed something was down there, but he did not believe it was bodies. The captain put on the suit himself. He went down. He went down through the same cold water, to the same steep slope, to the same 50 meters, and when he stood on the bottom, he understood. There were bodies down there. They were not bodies of men. They were bodies of bronze. They were bodies of marble. They were the limbs and torsos and faces of statues, half buried in the silt of the seabed, lying where they had fallen, where they had been falling, slowly. For 2,000 years, there were horses, there were heads, there was a bronze arm reaching out of the sand. There were amphorae, the great clay jars that the ancient world used to carry wine and oil and grain, scattered everywhere among the bronze, and broken, and whole, and half-eaten by the worms of the sea. Kondos came back up, and he sat on the deck, and he thought about what he had just seen. He thought about it for the rest of that day. He thought about it for the trip back to Syme. He thought about it through the winter. And when the spring came, in 1901, he took what he had seen to the Greek government in Athens. We will come back to the bronze and to the gears that were hidden inside one of the lumps that Kondos's divers brought up, but first, you should understand what it was, exactly, that they had stumbled into, because the seabed off Antikythera was not a graveyard, it was a shipwreck. It was a Roman ship, or a Greek ship in Roman hands, that had been carrying a cargo of looted art from the Greek world back to a buyer somewhere in the west, probably to Rome itself, probably for a wealthy man's villa, probably for a triumph. Some scholars think the ship may have been sailing in the 1st century before the Common Era, around the year 65 before the Common Era, perhaps a little later, perhaps a little earlier. What is clear is that the ship had gone down in deep water, on a rocky slope, in a bad storm, and that everything she had been carrying had stayed there. The art, the amphorae, the jewelry, the glassware, the bones of the crew, and one small, heavy, unremarkable lump of corroded bronze that nobody, in the spring of 1901, had any particular reason to look at twice. You should think, for a moment, about how the ship went down. You can almost see it. A merchant vessel, broad in the beam, low in the water, heavy with cargo, working her way across the channel between Crete and the small islands, the wind from the north, the sea rising, the crew, perhaps, trying to find shelter, exactly as Kondos's fleet would 2,000 years later on the same patch of water, the wind shifting. The vessel driven onto the rocks of Antikythera, the cargo shifting in the hold, the men going into the water, the ship slipping slowly down the steep slope into the dark. You should picture the silt closing over her, the amphorae spilling out, the statues tumbling, the lump in its wooden case settling somewhere among the rest. You should picture the slow centuries. The Greek government, when Kondos brought the news to Athens, moved quickly. By the standards of 1901, they moved very quickly. They sent a navy ship. They commissioned the salvage. They contracted Kondos and his Simiot crew to do the work, because nobody else in Greece could dive that deep. They paid them in cash, and in a share of what they brought up, and in honor. 2 members of the crew were given medals, after, by the government, for what they had done. You should remember that. You should remember the medals, because the work itself was, quietly, terrible. You should try, for a moment, to imagine what it was like. The salvage went on through the winter of 1901 and into the summer of 1902. The Simiot men went down, one at a time, in the canvas suits, with the copper helmets, to the same 50-meter slope. They went down again and again. They could only stay for a few minutes at a time, at that depth, before they had to come up. They could only come up so often, in a day, before the bubbles in their blood became a danger. The artifacts on the seabed were heavy. The bronzes were heavy. The marbles were heavier. The amphorae, full of silt and water, were heavier still. The men strapped them in ropes. The men dug them out of the silt with their gloved hands. The men signaled to the boat above, and the boat above pulled the artifacts, slowly, slowly, up through the dark water. One of them died. A diver, on one of the runs, went down too deep, or stayed too long, or came up too fast. The records are not exactly clear on which, and the bubbles got him. He died on the deck of the salvage ship. The others carried him home to Simi, and they buried him there. 2 more of them were paralyzed by the same thing. The bends, the decompression sickness, the bubbles forming in the blood, and the joints and the spine. The men of Simi had known about it. They had buried friends from it. And here, on this slope, off this small island, 3 of them paid for the ancient world's spilled cargo with their bodies. You should remember that too. You should remember their names when you can find them, and the silence around them when you cannot. Most of the names did not come down to us. The salvage ledgers list a handful. The rest are simply in the records of the Greek navy of that year, the crew of Captain Kondos. You should hold them all the same. And what they brought up a bronze statue of a boy. He is in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens now, and you can stand in front of him, and you can look at him. He is called the Antikythera youth. He is perhaps 400 years older than the wreck itself. Some scholars think he was made by Euphranar in the 4th century before the Common Era. He is naked. He is reaching out one hand. His face is calm. His eyes are inset, made of glass paste, still bright. He is one of the finest surviving bronzes from the ancient Greek world. He came up out of the silt of the Antikythera channel in pieces, and the museum put him back together. They brought up a marble head of a philosopher. They brought up a bronze head, also, of a bearded man with a furrowed brow, the kind of face you might see on a coin from one of the Eastern Hellenistic kingdoms. They brought up amphorae, Dozens of them. They brought up coins. They brought up gold rings. They brought up the small, thin shapes of glass cups, melted and warped, but still recognizable as cups. They brought up the bones of horses. They brought up, eventually, the bones of the crew. And in among all of it, they brought up a lump. You would not have looked at it twice. It was a corroded shape. It was the size, perhaps, of a large book. It was heavy. It was the color of old olives, dark green and grey, with patches of bronze still visible through the corrosion in places. It had once been encased in wood. The wood was mostly gone. There was a faint impression of carving still visible on one face, perhaps. There were lines on it. There were edges. If you had been one of the museum staff in the spring of 1902, and you had been asked to catalogue the contents of the Antikythera salvage, you would have written this lump up in a single short line, and you would have moved on to the next object on the table. There were many objects on the table. The Antikythera youth was being reassembled in the next room. You had a great deal of work to do. The salvage team, when they handed it over to the museum staff in Athens, did not draw any particular attention to it. It was one of many objects. It was filed and catalogued and put in a case and largely forgotten. The Antikythera youth was the prize. The marbles were the prize. The lump was a footnote. You should think about what it would have meant to you if you had been a museum porter on the loading dock that spring. You would have seen the crates coming off the salvage ship. You would have helped lift the bronzes. You would have run your hand, perhaps, over the cold limb of the Antikythera youth before he went into the workroom. You would not have looked twice at the smaller crate with the corroded lump inside it. Nobody did. Why would you have? We will come back to the lump and to the man in 1902 who first cracked it open and looked inside, but first you should understand the room it was sitting in. The National Archaeological Museum in Athens, in the early years of the 20th century, was a quiet place. It was a place of long corridors. It was a place of high ceilings. It was a place of tall glass cases and small printed cards. The light came in through tall windows. The floors were tiled in marble. The dust drifted in the light. If you walked through it on a winter afternoon, you would have heard your own footsteps echoing back to you from the high ceiling. You would have smelled the faint chalk smell of old plaster and the deeper smell of the marble itself, cool even in summer. The museum was full of treasures that had only recently come out of the ground. The bronzes from Antikythera were a new arrival, and they took most of the attention. The Antikythera youth, in particular, was the talk of the museum. He was being reassembled. He was being studied. Visitors came to look at him. The lump was sitting somewhere off to one side, in a case, with a label, and nobody was much looking at it. Nobody, that is, except a man called Valerios Stais. You should hold his name for a moment. Valerios Stais. He is the second person after Elias Stadiatis on the seabed that this story will hinge on. He was an archaeologist. He was, in 1902, one of the directors of the National Archaeological Museum. He was a man in his 40s. He had a beard. He had a careful, quiet way of moving through a room. He had a habit of going back to things, of looking again, of picking up the object that everyone else had walked past and turning it in his hands and asking it questions. In the spring of 1902, in a small workroom in the museum, with the dust drifting in the slanted light from the tall windows, Stais was doing exactly that. He had the lump in front of him on a table. He was looking at it. He had been looking at it, off and on, for weeks. There was something about the shape of it that bothered him. The corrosion had cracks running through it. The cracks ran in lines. The lines were not the lines of a natural fracture. The lines were regular. They suggested that, underneath the rind of corrosion and bronze and salt, there was a shape. Stais picked up the lump. He turned it. He set it down again. He picked up a small tool. He cleaned, gently, along the line of one of the cracks. You should be in the room with him. You should hear the small scrape of the tool. You should hear the faint flake of corrosion falling onto the wood of the table. You should hold your breath as he is holding his. And the corrosion came away. What came away with it was a piece of bronze, a small, flat, broken piece of bronze that had been hidden inside the larger lump. And on the flat face of that piece of bronze, there were teeth. There were small, neat, triangular teeth cut along a curved edge. They were the teeth of a gear. You should sit with that for a moment. A gear, a machine part, a small, precise, deliberately cut row of teeth on a curved bronze edge, hidden inside a corroded lump that had been lying on a Greek seabed since the time of Cicero. Stais stood there, in the workroom, in the slanted light, and he looked at the piece of bronze, and he understood, in that moment, that the lump was not a lump, the lump was a machine. You should understand what that meant in the year 1902 for a man like Valerios Stais. The ancient Greeks were known for many things. By then, they were known for their philosophers and their poets and their mathematicians. They were known for their sculptures and their temples. They were known for the geometry of Euclid and the calculations of Archimedes and the writings of Heron of Alexandria. But they were not known for machines. They were not known, in any concrete way, for gears. There were a few hints in the old texts. Cicero had written, in the 1st century before the Common Era, about a device that his teacher Posidonius had owned, a small thing of bronze that imitated the movements of the sun and the moon and the wandering stars, but no such device had ever been found. No physical example of ancient Greek gearwork had ever come out of the ground. The standard view, the view that every European scholar had been taught, was that complicated geared machines belonged to the medieval world, to the cathedral clocks, to the astrolabes of the Islamic Golden Age, to the late afterglow of the classical world, not to its heart. And here, in his hand, in 1902, was a gear that had come up out of a shipwreck that was, by every measure, 2,000 years old. We will come back to Cicero and to the writings that suggest there had once been other devices like this one, but first, you should know what Stais did next. He wrote a paper. He wrote a careful, formal, academic paper. He presented the lump. He described the gear. He described the lines of the corroded surface, where he believed there were inscriptions in ancient Greek. He suggested, in cautious and measured language, that the lump was an astronomical device, a calculator of some kind, a thing for tracking the motions of the heavens. He suggested it was Greek, and that it came from the wreck, and that it was therefore from the 1st century before the Common Era. He published the paper. He sent it out into the world. He waited for the world to answer. The world did not answer. The world did not answer because, by the standards of the world, Stais was wrong. Or rather, by the standards of the world, Stais was making a claim that could not be true. A geared astronomical computer in the 1st century before the Common Era, a piece of mechanical engineering 2,000 years old that should not exist. The scholars who read his paper read it carefully, and they considered it carefully, and they decided, almost unanimously, that he was mistaken. The lump, they said, was a contamination. The lump, they said, had fallen into the wreck site at a later date. The lump, they said, was medieval. It was the remains of a clock, perhaps from a Venetian or Byzantine ship that had passed over the same patch of seabed centuries after the original wreck. The seabed off Antikythera was a busy channel. The waters had carried many ships across it. Some of those ships had also gone down. It was easy, the scholars said, to imagine a later wreck depositing a later object into the cargo of an earlier wreck. That was the official answer. The official answer was wrong, but the official answer was the official answer, and the official answer held. Stais argued against it. He pointed out, quietly, that the lump had been encrusted in the same matrix of corrosion and seabed sediment as the other artifacts. He pointed out that the lump had been brought up by the same divers, on the same dives, from the same slope. He pointed out that the inscriptions, what could be read of them, were in a Greek of the right period. He pointed out the letters themselves, the careful Hellenistic capitals, the small, precise forms. He pointed all of this out in the careful and measured language that was the language of his profession. Nobody listened. Or rather, a few people listened, and they nodded, and they put the lump back in its case, and they walked away, and the lump went into its case. You should picture the case, for a moment, a tall glass cabinet, in a corner of one of the museum's side rooms, a small printed card, a label, in Greek and in French, describing the lump in a single short paragraph. The lump itself, sitting on a small wooden stand, with the gear that Stais had uncovered visible on one face, and the rest of the lump still encased in its rind of corrosion. You should picture the door of the room. You should picture the curator pulling the door shut behind him and turning the key and walking away down the corridor. The case sat in a corner of the museum. The lump sat in the case. The years went past. 1903, 1905. The label on the case yellowed slightly. The dust gathered along the edges of the bronze. The cracks in the corrosion deepened. Inside the lump, the gears sat in the dark, where they had been sitting since before Caesar crossed the Rubicon. 1910, 1912. The Balkan Wars came and went. The label on the case yellowed a little more. 1914. The First World War began, in the streets of Sarajevo, in the trenches of France, in the ships of the North Sea, in the desert columns of the Near East. The lump sat in its case. The lump did not move. You should picture the museum, through those years, the marble floors, still cool, the tall windows, still letting in the slanted light, the dust, drifting. The visitors, fewer now, because of the war, the bronzes from Antikythera, still standing in their places, the Antikythera youth still reaching out his calm bronze hand, the lump still sitting in its case in the corner. 1918, the war ends, the lump does not move. 1920, 1923. The museum slowly fills again with visitors. The Antikythera youth is still the star. The lump is still in its corner. Stais died in 1923. He died believing what he had seen. He died believing he had been right about the gears. He died without anyone of consequence agreeing with him. The lump outlived him. The lump was still in its case the day they carried his coffin out of the museum building. You should hold that too. A man going to his grave, knowing he had been right, and knowing that the world had not believed him. A small, corroded shape of bronze on a wooden stand, in a glass case, surviving him. 1930, 1935. The label on the case yellows further. The lump does not move. 1939. The Second World War begins. The museum, eventually, packs its treasures into crates. The bronzes are taken down. The marbles are crated. The lump is crated too, somewhere in the inventory, somewhere in a list. The crates are taken away to safer places, in the hills, in cellars, in the caves outside the city. Athens is occupied, Greece is occupied, the war goes on. The bronzes of Antikythera spend the war in the dark, in crates, in cellars, in the same kind of slow darkness that they had spent the 2,000 years before. The lump is in there with them. The lump does not move. 1945. The war ends. The crates come back. The Antikythera youth is set up again in his place in the museum. The marbles are dusted off. The lump is taken out of its crate and put back in its case, in its corner. Nobody now remembers Stais's paper from 1902. Nobody now remembers the argument about the gears. The lump has been sitting in its case for almost half a century, and the official answer is the official answer. And the lump is a piece of medieval contamination, and that is what it will remain. We will come back to the men who proved that wrong, decades from now, with X-rays and computer tomography and the patient work of a generation. But first, you should sit with the silence. 50 years of silence. A man on a seabed in a canvas suit in 1900. A man in a workroom with a gear in his hand in 1902. And then 50 years of nothing, of the lump in its case, of the dust drifting in the slanted light, of 2 wars passing in the streets outside, and the lump not moving, not being looked at, not being understood. You should think about how many people walked past that case. How many school children on outings, how many couples on a Sunday afternoon, how many tourists, how many curators. How many of them, looking through the glass at the small corroded shape on its wooden stand, must have thought, for half a second, that they were missing something, and then walked on. And then, in the early 1950s, in the museum, on a quiet afternoon, the door of the workroom opens. A man comes in. He has a beard and an English voice and a habit of asking questions about the things that everyone else has walked past. He stands in front of the case in the corner. He looks at the label. He looks at the lump. He turns to the curator with him, and he says, quietly, that he would like a closer look. He would like to take the lump out of the case. He would like, if it was possible, to take an X-ray. His name is Derek de Solla Price, and the silence of the lump, of the gears, of the 50 years is about to end. His name is Derek de Solla Price. You should picture him that afternoon in the workroom of the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. He is in his early 30s, a soft beard, a tweed jacket, a slight stoop from too many hours over books. He is English by birth, the son of a tailor from Leighton, in the east of London. He has a degree in physics and a second doctorate in the history of science. He is, you should understand, one of the very few people alive who is fluent in both worlds. He can read a Greek inscription. He can also read an X-ray plate. He has come to Athens on a small travel grant because, months earlier, in a quiet library, he had stopped at a small black and white photograph of a corroded lump on a wooden stand, and he had not been able to forget it. The curator with him is patient and tired and a little curious. You can see him too, standing a step behind. He has had many people through this workroom over the years, none of them with much follow-through. He watches Price approach the case in the corner. He watches him stand in front of it for a long moment. You watch with him. You see the way Price's hands are very still at his sides. The curator unlocks the case. He lifts the lump out. slowly, with both hands, and he sets it down on a piece of green felt on the work table. The lump is a little smaller than a shoebox now. Decades of drying have shrunk it. It is the color of stone, mottled green and grey, and the faded brown of corroded copper. The work table is wooden, scored from a century of work, and the light from the high windows falls across it in long, slanted bars. Outside, you can hear Athens, a tram, a motorbike, a man calling out the price of fruit. In the lane behind the building, you can almost smell the workroom. Old paper, old wood, and the faint, sweet, metallic tang of bronze that has been a long time underwater. You are standing, in your mind, just inside the door. Price puts on a pair of cotton gloves. He picks the lump up. He weighs it in his hands. You watch him turn it slowly. He looks at the edge where Stais saw the gear, 50 years before. The edge is still there. The gear teeth are still there. Tiny, triangular, absolutely regular, waiting in this case, in this corner of this museum, for someone to come back and ask the question that nobody had asked. You should hold that. Half a century of teeth still cut sharp, under a crust of corrosion, waiting. He sets the lump down. He looks at the curator. He says, in his quiet voice, that he would like, please, if it is possible, to take an X-ray. He gets his X-ray. It takes years. He goes home. He comes back. He stares for hours at the cloudy grey plates, with their faint suggestions of teeth, their overlapping ghosts of wheels. You see him at his desk. He maps them onto graph paper. He counts. He talks to colleagues, in low voices, at conferences. Some tell him, kindly, that he is wasting his time. You can hear the kindness and the dismissal in the same sentence. The lump is medieval. The lump is contamination. The lump is not worth a career. He goes back to his X-rays. In 1959, he writes an article in Scientific American, short, illustrated with small line drawings of gears. The headline says, simply, an ancient Greek computer. The article is read by, perhaps, 500,000 people. Some write to him, most dismiss it, but the phrase stays. You can almost hear it land. An ancient Greek computer. A handful of words attached to a small corroded lump in a glass case in a museum in Athens. From this point on, the lump will never quite be invisible again. You can imagine yourself, even now, as one of those readers, a magazine open on your lap, a picture of small bronze teeth. You should understand what Price is doing in those years. He is taking flat grey plates of overlapping shadows, and from those shadows he is trying to extract three-dimensional machines. You can imagine him in his Yale office, in the evenings, the desk lamp on, the grey X-ray plates pinned to a backlit board, a magnifying glass, a pencil, a sheet of graph paper, a tooth here, a tooth there, a faint arc, behind another arc, behind another arc, 40 wheels, perhaps, all overlapping, all pressed flat by the camera, all asking him, in a soft and stubborn voice, to be unbraided. You should sit with what it is to spend a year on a single shadow. He works for a decade. He works for 2. He needs a better picture. And so, in the early 1970s, he reaches out to 2 people in Athens who can help him. A Greek nuclear physicist named Charalampos Karakalos and his wife, Emily, a fellow scientist. You should keep their names. The Karakaloses are not historians. They are people who know how to make radiation behave. They have access to a laboratory in Athens with the right equipment, and they agree, after some persuasion, to look at the lump. You are standing, in your mind, In the doorway of the Karakalos lab, a small room, concrete walls, metal shielding, the heavy smell of ozone in your nose. The Karakaloses set the fragments. There are several now, the lump having broken in the years since Stais into careful position. They use gamma rays. They use X-rays at angles Price could never use. The plates accumulate. They develop them, night after night, and lay them out, and study them. You watch them work. And on those plates, for the first time, the interior of the mechanism begins to show itself. You should picture the plate, laid out on a bench under a low lamp. The gear teeth, counted carefully, fragment by fragment, come back in sharper numbers. 30 wheels are confirmed, then more. The triangular teeth, all cut by hand, all spaced with a precision that does not match the stories the textbooks tell about the 2nd century before Christ. You should sit with that. The textbooks said it could not be done. The plates, in the cold light of the lab, are quietly saying it was. Price gets the plates. Price writes again. In 1974, he publishes a monograph, 70 pages long. He calls it Gears from the Greeks. You should hold the title. Price gets a great deal of it right. He proves, beyond any honest doubt, that the device is a Greek analog computer. He proves it computed the metonic cycle, that 19-year reconciliation of the sun and the moon. He establishes that it was driven by a hand crank on the side, and that the crank set in motion a great cascade of gears. He dates the device to around 80 BC. Price also gets things wrong. He believes there is a differential gear inside, a small mechanical jewel that would not be reinvented for another 1500 years. The differential gear, as it turns out, is not there. He misreads some of the gear arrangements. He cannot quite see how the planets would have been tracked, and he leaves the question open with apologies for the future. But what he has built, in 70 quiet pages, is the first true skeleton of the device. You should hold the image of that map, a small monograph, a handful of diagrams, a few stubborn errors, the frame, nonetheless, of everything that follows. And then, in 1983, Derek de Solla Price dies. Suddenly, a heart attack. He is 61 years old. The mantle of the man who has been carrying the lump in his hands for 30 years falls. For a moment it seems possible that the lump will go back into its case and stay there, and nobody will pick the work up again. You should sit with that. You see the desk, still as he left it, the X-ray plate still pinned to the board, the half-drawn diagrams on the graph paper, the lamp still on, the empty chair. But the mantle is picked up almost immediately by a quiet man in London. His name is Michael Wright. You should keep his name too. He is a curator at the Science Museum on Exhibition Road in South Kensington, an engineer by training, a watchmaker by inclination. He has been following Price's work for years. He believes there is more in the lump than Price was able to see. And he has access, in his own museum, to a kind of imaging that Price did not, linear X-ray tomography, the ability to take many thin slices through the body of the lump and to look at each slice on its own. Wright works through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, often with a colleague named Alan Bromley, an Australian computer historian. They slice the fragments in radiographic depth, layer by layer. You should picture the slices laid out on a table, each one a different cross-section. They do what the old plates could not. They show the gears in 3 dimensions. They show them in their proper places. You should let yourself feel the difference. A flat plate gives you a ghost. A stack of slices gives you a body. And it is here, in Wright's slow, meticulous work, that one of the great surprises of the mechanism emerges. The back dials, the two large dials on the back face of the case. Price had drawn them as concentric circles, like the rings of a target, one inside the other, like the faces of two ordinary clocks set into one panel. Wright, looking at his slices, sees something else. He sees a spiral. You should see it with him. He sees that the upper back dial is not a circle at all, but a 5-turn spiral, winding outwards from the center, like the slow opening of a fern. And he sees that the lower back dial is also a spiral, of 4 turns, equally patient, equally deliberate. The device is more complicated than Price said, and it is also more beautiful. You should let that settle. A spiral, not a circle, on a Greek instrument from 2 centuries before the birth of Christ. We'll come back to the lunar anomaly mechanism, the most ingenious thing on the device. A small piece of bronze that does, with a pin and a slot, what would later take Western astronomers more than 1,000 years to mechanize. But first, you should understand what happened next, because the lump, by the time the millennium turns, is finally about to be properly seen. The year is 2005. A new project begins, the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, AMRP, for short. You should hold the initials, AMRP. They will return again and again. It is led by a mathematician named Tony Freeth in Cardiff and an astrophysicist named Mike Edmonds, also at Cardiff University. They build a team: astronomers, epigraphers, imaging engineers, programmers, museum staff. You can picture the meetings, quiet rooms, in Cardiff and Athens, with cups of tea on the table. They convince the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, after years of polite conversation, to let them do what no one has done before. The scanner is built for them by a company in England called X-Tech Systems, run by an engineer named Roger Hadland. It is the size of a small van. It weighs 8 tons. You should hold that. 8 tons. It is, essentially, a microfocus computed tomography machine designed for inspecting cracks in aircraft turbine blades, adapted to look instead at corroded Greek bronze. The X-Tech team load it into a truck in England and drive it across the continent. You can almost follow them on a map. A ferry, the heel of Italy. Another ferry, across the Adriatic, Greece, Athens. They unload it, slowly, at the side door of the National Archaeological Museum. 8 tons of polished metal, on the threshold of a building that holds the bronzes of 2,000 years. You should hold the picture. The new machine on one side, the old statues on the other. You should imagine that night. You should imagine the doors of the museum closed, the visitors gone, the marble floors empty. The Antikythera youth still standing in his case, his calm bronze hand still reaching out into the air. And in a back room, in a corner, the X-Tech scanner being wheeled into place. You are there too, in your mind, against the wall, watching, the room cleared, cables run, lights dimmed, the fragments brought out, one by one, in their foam-lined boxes, by people wearing white cotton gloves. You watch the gloves. Fragment A, the largest, set into the cradle of the machine, carefully, as you would set a sleeping child. The scanner is closed, the room is sealed. A man, somewhere down the hall, sits at a screen. You stay with him. The machine wakes up. A low electrical hum begins and rises and settles. You can hear it in your bones if you stand close enough. It is the sound of a small power plant in a small room, cooling fans. beam generators, detector arrays, the scanner begins its work. It sends a thin pencil of X-rays through fragment A from one side at one angle, then another angle, then another, then thousands of angles all night in the kind of methodical, repetitive sweep that machines do better than men. On the screen down the hall, the man waits. You wait with him. The first images begin to come in. You should imagine what he sees. That night, you should imagine yourself at the screen. He sees, on the monitor, a wedge of grey that resolves, slowly, into a slice through the fragment. He sees, in the slice, the corrosion, the calcite, the marine salts, the void where bronze has been eaten away, and then, in the center of the slice, almost gently, almost shyly, a tooth, a single triangular tooth on the edge of a gear, with the precision of a clockmaker's file, hidden inside the calcified rock for 2,000 years, suddenly visible. In pale grey, on a flat-screen monitor in Athens, at 3 o'clock in the morning, you should hold the picture of that tooth. He stares at it. He does not call anyone. He sits there for a long time, with the slice on the screen, and the gear tooth in the center of the slice, and the hum of the scanner down the hall, and the marble silence of the museum all around him. You sit there with him. By morning there are more slices. By the end of the week, every fragment that the team can scan has been scanned. The data goes back, in hard drives, to laboratories in Britain. There it will be turned, by software, into three-dimensional models. Every gear, every spoke, every tooth, every nick and dent, and patch of corrosion. The mechanism, for the first time in 20 centuries, can be looked at as if it were transparent. You should feel the strangeness. A machine that has been a stone for 2,000 years, becoming a machine again, slowly, on a computer screen, in a quiet office somewhere in the south of England. At the same time, another team is doing a different kind of looking. Hewlett-Packard sends a physicist named Tom Malsbender with a polynomial texture mapper. A hemispherical dome, lit by dozens of small lights, each switched on and off in sequence. You set the fragment under the dome. You take a photograph for each light from a different angle. You stitch them together in software, and you can rotate the light over the surface, virtually in any direction you like. You rake it across the bronze at a half-degree above the surface, and you watch shadows leap out of grooves that had been invisible under ordinary museum lighting. The bronze comes alive. The polynomial texture mapper does, for the surface of the mechanism, what the X-Tech scanner does for the interior. It doubles the readable text. Letters that no human eye had seen since the 2nd century before Christ, Greek letters a millimeter high, begin to glow on a screen. Words, whole words, names of months, names of cycles, names of planets, names of games. A user's manual, in fact, returning to the world, one letter at a time. You should let that settle. A book, in bronze, that nobody had read for 20 centuries, reappearing on a screen, line by line. In November 2006, in the journal Nature, the AMRP team write down what they have found. The title of the paper is simple: Decoding the ancient Greek astronomical calculator known as the Antikythera Mechanism. You should hold the names of the authors: Tony Freeth, Yanis Bitsakis, Xenophon Moussas, John Seradakis, Mike Edmonds, and several more. They list, for the first time, the full architecture of the device. They map all 30 surviving gears. They confirm the back dials are spirals. They confirm the device tracked the irregular motion of the moon. They confirm it predicted eclipses. They confirm, in calm scientific language, that a piece of bronze, made in the 2nd century before Christ, did things that nobody, in any school of history, had been willing to believe were possible. The paper is read in the great laboratories of the world, in the universities, in the museums. It is read, slowly, by ordinary people who buy magazines in airports and who frown and remember the phrase from somewhere else, perhaps from Price, in another decade. You can imagine yourself in that line, a magazine on a train, a short article, a picture of a strange wooden box. The lump, in its case in Athens, is no longer just a lump. The world has finally agreed that it is a machine, and the long silence is over. And so, having spent all this time on the men who decoded it, you should now spend some time, slowly, on the thing itself. You should let it be brought out, gently, in your mind, and set on a table in a quiet room, and reconstructed back into the object it once was, the doors closed, the bronze whole, the wood not yet rotted, the Greek letters still sharp. You should be allowed, for a little while, to handle it as the man who first owned it would have handled it. You sit at the table, you reach for the case, you draw it towards you. The mechanism, in its proper, intact form, is not much bigger than a shoebox. The wooden case is about 34 centimeters long, 18 centimeters tall, 9 centimeters deep. You can hold it, comfortably, in your 2 hands. You can feel its corners. It has the weight you would expect of a small box full of bronze, heavy enough that you would not casually toss it, light enough that you could carry it, easily, from one room to another. The wood is dark, oiled, finely fitted. The corners are bronzed, the hinges are bronzed. There is a small bronze knob on the right-hand side of the case. Your thumb finds it. You will come back to that knob. The case has 2 doors, one on the front, one on the back. Both are bronze sheet, and both are completely covered, edge to edge, in tiny Greek letters. About 1 millimeter high. You have to lean in to see them. They are written in Koine, the Greek of the Hellenistic world, from Alexandria to Antioch to Rhodes. They are the user's manual. They explain, in dense paragraphs, what each dial does, what each pointer means, how to read the eclipse glyphs, how to set the calendar ring, how to interpret the game's dial. You should imagine a man, perhaps an astronomer, perhaps a wealthy patron, sitting at a table by an oil lamp, with the case open, the doors propped up like little bronze pages. You sit on a stool across the table from him. You watch, open the front door. You are looking at the front face of the mechanism. It is dominated by a single large dial, perhaps 15 centimeters across. The dial has 2 concentric rings, one inside the other. The outer ring is the Egyptian calendar, 365 days, 12 months of 30 days each, plus 5 extra days at the end of the year. The way the priests of the Nile had been counting time since long before anyone in Greece had thought to write down the heavens. The ring is removable. You can lift it out with the tip of a fingernail. You can rotate it by 1 day and slot it back in every 4 years to handle what the Romans would later call a leap year. The Greeks who made this device understood the leap before the Roman calendar did. They built a way to handle it. In bronze, you hold the ring in your hand for a moment. You feel the small bronze tabs on its underside. You set it back. Inside the Egyptian calendar ring sits the inner ring, 360 degrees, divided into the 12 signs of the Greek zodiac: Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces. the same 12 names you would hear today on a morning radio horoscope or in a newspaper at the back of a cafe. The same band of stars that, on a clear summer night, you could still walk outside in any garden and trace above you. Each sign occupies 30 degrees on the ring. Each degree on the bronze is finely scribed. From the center of this dial, concentric tubular hands extend outwards, nested inside each other, like the hands on a fine wristwatch, except finer, because they have to track not two hands but many. One hand is the Sunday, one is the moon. On the moon's hand, near the tip, sits a small ball. The ball is split in half, painted, by hand, in two colors, one half silvered, one half blacked. As the moon's pointer creeps around the dial, the ball rotates on its own axis, and the silvered half turns towards or away from the Sunday. You glance at the ball, and you read the exact phase of the moon: a new moon, a waxing crescent, a first quarter, a gibbous, a full moon, a waning gibbous, a last quarter, a waning crescent. The full lunar month, displayed in a small painted ball the size of a pea, in the middle of a bronze dial, in a wooden box, in your hand, 2,000 years before electricity. And then there are the other hands, hands that do not survive: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. The user's manual names all five and gives their orbital periods in years. The physical gears that drove the planet hands are missing, lost to the sea, lost to the bronze melters of a later century. But the team at University College London in 2021, under Tony Freeth and Adam Wojcik, took the orbital periods from the inscriptions and the spacing on the front face, and they reverse-engineered a mechanism that fitted exactly into the 25mm gap behind the front dial. They used the 462-year cycle for Venus, the 442-year cycle for Saturn. They built a digital model. They built a brass model. They turned the crank. The planets moved. The retrograde loops appeared. The reconstruction is theoretical, but very close to what was once there. You should imagine the front face as it might have been. Small semi-precious stones, perhaps, on the planet hands. A bead of rock crystal for Mercury, carnelian for Mars, lapis for Saturn. Small colored wanderers, creeping in their loops around the zodiac. Now turn the device around in your mind. Lift it. Set it down the other way. Look at the back face. The back face is even busier than the front. Two large dials, one on top, one on the bottom, each carved as a spiral, not a circle, a spiral. You should let that sink in. Spirals on a precision astronomical device in the 2nd century before Christ. The upper dial is a 5-turn spiral. The lower dial is a 4-turn spiral. The pointers on these dials do not just rotate. They slowly walk outwards as well, riding in the groove, year after year, until they reach the outer turn, and then somebody resets them, gently, by hand. You should imagine that small moment of resetting. A man, a stylus, a careful hand, lifting a pointer and walking it back to the inner turn. The upper back dial is the Metonic dial, 19 years, 235 lunar months. A cycle that reconciles the sun and the moon, that brings the lunar calendar and the solar calendar back into alignment after almost exactly 2 decades. A cycle known to the Babylonians before the Greeks, and known to the Greeks through a man named Meton in Athens in the 5th century before Christ. The pointer on the Metonic dial walks the spiral slowly around its 5 turns, and the user, watching it, knows when the festivals of the calendar will fall. knows when a particular full moon will arrive, knows when a particular ploughing or sowing or harvesting season will land. You should think about how strange that is, to own a small wooden box that tells you, in advance, when your village will sow its grain. Nested inside the metonic spiral, set into a smaller subsidiary dial at the center, sits the Calippic cycle, 76 years, 4 metonic cycles. A further refinement, made by an astronomer named Callippus in the 4th century before Christ, to bring the calendar even more precisely into line with the heavens. A man could, with this dial, look at the calendar of his entire lifetime, and his father's lifetime, and his grandfather's lifetime, and see them as one slow curve on a bronze face. You could, if you wished, find your own birthday on it. You could find your father's. You could find your grandfather's. 3 lifetimes on one dial. Set beside the Calippic, on the upper back, sits another small subsidiary dial, the Olympiad dial, 4 years. At first, when the AMRP team began to read the letters on it, they thought it tracked only the Olympics, the great quadrennial games at Olympia, but more letters came up, more names. 2 epigraphers, Alexander Jones and Paul Iverson, read them out, one after another. You should hear them read. The Olympics, the Pythian Games, held at Delphi, the Isthmian Games, held near Corinth, the Nemean Games, the Na, held at Dodona, in northern Greece. And then, on the 5th slot, a name that mattered, the Haliaea, the games held on the island of Rhodes, in honor of Helios, the Sunday, a small word on a small bronze dial. We will come back to Rhodes. You should hold the name in your mind. Now look at the lower back dial, the bigger spiral, 4 turns. This is the Saros dial. The Saros cycle, 18 years and a third, 223 lunar months. A cycle so old that the Babylonian astronomers had used it for centuries before the Greeks. The Saros is the rhythm of eclipses. Every 223 months, the geometry of the sun, earth, and moon repeats itself almost exactly, and an eclipse that happened in one Saros cycle will happen again in another part of the world in the next. Walk your eye slowly around the Saros spiral. Each turn is divided into months. Each month is a small cell. Inside many of the cells, you see, on the original bronze, a small glyph. You lean closer to the dial, a Greek letter sigma, a Greek letter eta. The sigma, C, is from the Greek for sun. It marks a solar eclipse. The eta, E, is from the Greek for moon. It marks a lunar eclipse. Beneath the letters, smaller letters tell you the time of day the eclipse is predicted to fall, the hour, in the Greek 24-hour system, day or night, north shadow, south shadow, a small note about visibility. Cell after cell, a Greek would walk his eye through the years, decade by decade, and read off the predicted eclipses of a man's lifetime. You should let your own eye walk a turn with him. Inside the Saros spiral, on a smaller subsidiary dial, sits the exeligmos, 3 Saros cycles, 54 years, a correction dial. The Saros, as a cycle, is not exactly a whole number of days. It is 223 lunar months, plus about a third of a day. 3 Saros cycles bring you back, almost exactly, to a whole number of days. The exeligmos dial tells the user that, on a particular eclipse in the Saros spiral, he must add 8 hours, or 16 hours, or 0, depending on which Saros of the 3 the eclipse falls within. It is a footnote, in bronze. A small, almost apologetic gear, doing the unglamorous correction work that any honest piece of astronomy requires. You should respect it in the way you respect the small print at the bottom of a careful page. And inside the device, behind these dials, sits the thing that the men who made it should be remembered for above all else: the lunar anomaly mechanism. You promised yourself you would come back to it. Here it is. The Greek astronomers knew, by careful observation, that the moon does not move evenly across the sky. Sometimes it races, sometimes it slows. You can see this for yourself. If you watch the moon across enough months, they knew, in their own language, that this had to do with where the moon was in its orbit. Faster at one point, slower at the opposite point. The astronomer Hipparchus, working in the 2nd century before Christ on the island of Rhodes, gave the irregularity a mathematical form. He said the moon moves on an eccentric circle, a circle offset from the Earth, and the apparent speed changes because of the geometry of the offset. He could predict, with his equations, where the moon would be on any given night. You should hold the name Hipparchus on Rhodes in the 2nd century before Christ. The men who built the Antikythera mechanism took Hipparchus's equation and they built it, not as numbers on a papyrus, as a small piece of bronze inside the case, behind the dials. They took 2 gears. They put them on slightly offset axes. They cut a small slot in one of the gears. They drove a small pin from the other gear into the slot. As the gears turned, the pin slid back and forth in the slot because the axes were offset and the pin's position on the 2nd gear was forced to vary. The pin made the driven gear speed up and slow down and speed up again, exactly the way Hipparchus said the moon does. Not approximately, exactly. You should hold the picture of the pin in your mind for a moment. A small bronze pin, a small bronze slot, 2 gears, very nearly touching, very nearly the same, very slightly off. You should sit with that. A man, in a workshop, somewhere in the Hellenistic Mediterranean, looked at the equation for the irregular motion of the moon, and then he picked up a file, and he cut a slot in a piece of bronze, and the bronze did the equation. It did the equation every time the crank turned. It did the equation for the moon of the 2nd century before Christ, and for the moon of every century after. The pin slid in the slot, the gear sped up, the gear slowed. The moon, on the front face, walked through the zodiac at the speed it actually walks, not the speed a beginner would imagine, the speed a man with 30 years of careful observation would know. And now, finally, the crank, the small bronze knob on the right-hand side of the wooden case, the thing you have not yet touched. Place a finger on it. You can feel the corrosion under your fingertip. Turn it gently forward. Listen. A faint resistance. A soft click. Very soft. Almost a breath. The main drive wheel inside the case begins to rotate. The crown gear bites into its first follower. The follower bites into the next. The cascade begins. 40 wheels, or more, all engaging at once, all whirring softly, all turning at their own speed, all driven from the one small input under your thumb. On the front face, the sun pointer moves a degree. You watch it. The moon pointer moves about 13 times faster, because the moon orbits about 13 times more often than the sun appears to. The phase ball rolls a fraction. The planet hands creep, each at their own pace, into their own loops. On the back face, the metonic pointer slides outward along its spiral by a hair's width. The Saros pointer slides similarly. The Olympiad dial clicks. The Kallipic dial clicks. The Exeligmos dial does not move, because it only updates rarely, but it sits patiently, waiting for its moment. Turn the crank forward, a full revolution. A year passes. The dials all settle into the geometry of a year later. Turn it again. Another year. Turn it 10 times. 10 years. Turn it 80 times. Almost a Saros. On the lower back spiral, a small cell slides past the eclipse window. Inside the cell, a sigma. A solar eclipse, predicted by a Greek wooden box for the 24th day of an August nearly 2,000 years before you read this. The hour of the eclipse is engraved beneath the sigma. The shadow direction is noted. You could, if you were that man, walk out of your villa on that afternoon, look at the sky, and see the disk of the sun being eaten, exactly when your box had told you. You should hold the picture. A villa courtyard, a Greek sky, a sun in the late afternoon beginning to bite into itself exactly when the bronze said it would. Turn the crank backward. The year retreats. The sun pointer creeps back through Pisces, through Aquarius, through Capricorn. The moon races backwards. The phase ball rolls in reverse. The Saros pointer slides inwards along its spiral. The cell with the sigma slides out of the window. A different cell slides in. A lunar eclipse, Eta, for a winter night somewhere in the past. The dates are old. The dates are absurdly old. The man cranking the box in his lamplit room knows this. You know it too. He knows the device does not care whether the eclipse is past or future. He knows the device only cares about geometry. You should hold the calm of that. The device does not care. The geometry is the geometry. We'll come back, soon enough, to the question of who built it, whose hands cut the gears, whether it was a man named Archimedes in Syracuse, with the smoke of a city under siege drifting across his courtyard, whether it was Posidonius in Rhodes, in his quiet philosophical school by the sea, whether it was a workshop, a guild, a lineage that left no signature, no maker's mark, no surviving name. We'll come back to all of that. But first, sit for a moment longer with the device itself, the wooden box, the bronze doors, the micro-engraved manual, the front face with its zodiac and its Egyptian calendar, and its sun, and its moon, and its planet beads, the back face with its spirals, its metonic, its callipyc, its olympiad, its saros, its exeligmos, the pin sliding in its slot, inside the case, doing the equation of Hipparchus 10,000 times a year, in silence. Sit with the small bronze knob on the side. Sit with the soft click as you turn it. Sit with the thought that someone, 2,000 years ago, sat in a similar room, in a similar lamplight, with this same object on his table, and turned this same knob, and watched these same dials, and saw the exact same sun, the exact same moon, the exact same phase ball rolling its silver and its black, the exact same eclipse glyph sliding into the exact same window. You should hold him in your mind. The geometry has not changed. The moon still races. The sun still creeps. The Saros still repeats. The Olympics still come and go, every 4 years. And even tonight, somewhere on the planet, a torch is being lit or extinguished in the rhythm the dial knew. The device is a machine, but the machine is also a kind of mirror. It shows the sky now just as well as it showed the sky then. You could read it tomorrow, and the year after, and the century after. The bronze is older. The bronze is in fragments, in a glass case, in a quiet hall in Athens. But the equations are the same. And so the question now, finally, is not what the device does. The question now is who. Who imagined it? Who drew it? Who filed the gears in a workshop somewhere on a Greek hillside, in a port town of the 2nd century before Christ? Whose hands, whose mind, whose lineage of teachers and apprentices and ideas reached its small, precise crescendo in this wooden box that ended up, at last, on the sea floor off Antikythera, in the dark, with the corpses and horses that were not corpses and not horses, waiting for a frightened sponge diver in a copper helmet to find it. You should hold the question. You should sit with it. The answer is coming. The answer is coming. Slowly, the way most answers in this story have come, not from the device itself. The device is silent. It does not name its maker. It carries no signature, no dedication, no small inscribed line that says, "In the way a craftsman might, made by my own hand." The answer comes, instead, from a book. A Roman book written more than 100 years after the device was probably built by a man sitting at a writing table in a country villa, recounting a story he had heard, half remembered, about a Greek mathematician and a city under siege. You should hold the book in your mind. It is called Times de Re Publica, on the Republic. Its author is Marcus Tullius Cicero, the orator, the consul, the philosopher of late Republican Rome. He is writing in the years 54, 53, and 52 before Christ, in a villa outside the city, in lamplit evenings, with a stylus in his hand and the cool stone of his study around him. You should hold him in your mind, a man in middle age, a thin woolen tunic. You can see the lamp. You can see the slow scratch of the stylus on the wax. You can see a man who has read everything the Greek world has to offer, trying now, in late Republican Latin, to render some of that learning into the language of Rome. In the part of the book that survives, a conversation is taking place between two Romans of an earlier generation, Scipio Aemilianus, the general who would burn Carthage in 146 BC. His friend Gaius Laelius. You can see them sitting in a garden. You can see them talking about astronomy, and about the heavens, and about the strange habit Greek philosophers have of trying to make small machines that imitate the sky. Scipio tells a story. The story is about the city of Syracuse, on the eastern coast of the island of Sicily, 200 years before Cicero put pen to parchment. In 212 BC, the Roman general Marcus Claudius Marcellus laid siege to that city. Syracuse had sided with Carthage. Rome had sent its consul, with ships and legions, to bring it back into the Roman fold. The siege lasted 2 years. The defense of the city was directed, according to every ancient source, by an old mathematician. You know his name, Archimedes. He was, by then, around 70 years old. You should hold him in your mind. In his city, in the long second year of the siege, an old man in a long room, drawing on the floor. You know, broadly, how it ends. The city falls. The Roman troops pour through the breach in the wall. There is killing in the streets. There is looting. Marcellus, by some accounts, gives orders that the old mathematician must not be harmed. The orders do not reach the soldier who finds him. You should hold the picture. Archimedes is in his courtyard, by every surviving telling, drawing geometrical figures in the dust, a figure in the sand, a circle, perhaps, or a square inscribed in a circle. A Roman soldier appears. The soldier kills him with a sword. The man who has just engineered, more or less single-handed, the entire mechanical defense of one of the great cities of the Mediterranean is killed by an infantryman who does not know his name. You should sit with that picture for a moment longer. The dust, the figure, the Roman sword, the death of a man whose mind, 8 years earlier, had been used to keep this very army from coming over the wall. Marcellus, when he hears, weeps He has Archimedes buried with honors, and then, because he is a Roman general, he begins the work of cataloguing the spoils. Syracuse is wealthy. There are statues and tapestries and gold. Most of it will go to the Roman state, paraded in his triumph. But Marcellus, according to Cicero, takes for himself, personally, only 2 objects out of that entire siege, 2 bronze devices built by Archimedes. One is a celestial globe, a simple thing, a sphere with the constellations marked on its surface, a teaching tool. The other is stranger, a bronze sphere, geared internally, that mechanically reproduces, at each revolution, the motions of the sun and the moon and the 5 known planets, a machine that predicted eclipses, a machine that showed, in miniature, the heavens. You should hear the description, slowly, in your mind. Cicero says that this second device, this geared sphere, was kept in the Temple of Honor and Valor in Rome for 200 years after Marcellus brought it there. He says it was admired. He says it was famous. He says, in passing, that no one alive in his own day could build another one because the lineage of mechanics who knew how had been broken. The temple device is now gone. We have no idea what happened to it. It was probably looted or melted or simply lost in one of the many fires that took Rome over the centuries that followed. But the description survives. The bronze sphere, the geared interior, the sun and the moon and the 5 planets and the eclipses. You should hold that description against the device you have been sitting with, the wooden table, the zodiac, the calendar, the phase ball, the Saros spiral. The match is almost too clean. Cicero is describing, at 2 centuries remove, a machine that does what the device on your table does. There is a second passage. You should hold this one carefully. It is in another of Cicero's books, De Natura Deorum, on the nature of the gods. There, Cicero is arguing that the order of the cosmos implies an ordering intelligence. To press the point, he reaches for a contemporary example. He says, casually, almost in an aside, that his friend Posidonius has recently constructed a device which at each revolution reproduces the motions of the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets that take place in the heavens every day and every night. The same description. The same machine. Only this time the maker is not a dead Greek of 2 centuries before. This time the maker is a man Cicero knew personally. You should hold him in your mind too. Posidonius. Posidonius of Apamea, also called Posidonius of Rhodes, because he ran his school there. A Stoic philosopher, a polymath, an astronomer, a man who taught Cicero himself. During Cicero's own studies on the island, the school sat on the coast. You should hold the place in your mind. Rhodes, in the early 1st century before Christ, a long port, a harbour where the ships of half the eastern Mediterranean come in. Wide white stone steps down to the water, olive trees. The sea, very blue. The school is somewhere up the slope, a modest stone building with shaded colonnades, with rooms where men sit and read. You can hear the sea, faintly, through the open windows. You can smell the dust on warm stone. Posidonius is an old man by the time Cicero meets him. He has spent his life thinking about geometry, about tides, about the size of the Sunday, and in his workshop there is a geared bronze device that imitates the sky. You should sit with the Rhodes hypothesis for a moment. The shipwreck off Antikythera, dated by its cargo of coins and amphorae to around 70 or 60 before Christ, was carrying Rhodian goods. The amphorae are Rhodian. The likeliest reading is that the cargo came out of Rhodes, or out of Asia Minor through Rhodes, on its way to Rome. The device on board names, on its Olympiad dial, the Haliaea. The Haliaea was the local festival of Rhodes, in honor of Helios, the sun god, whose colossal statue had once stood at the entrance to the Rhodian harbour. The dial would not list the Haliaea unless the device had a Rhodian reader in mind, or a Rhodian maker. Posidonius's school is on Rhodes. Posidonius is described by Cicero as the maker of exactly this kind of device. The dating fits, the geography fits, the customer base fits. Many scholars have concluded, working through this evidence quietly, that the device on the table in front of you, in your imagination, was almost certainly built in or near Posidonius's workshop in the early 1st century before Christ. There is one more figure to add to this room. You should hold him in your mind as well. His name is Hipparchus, Hipparchus of Nicaea. He lived between roughly 190 and 120 before Christ. He spent the last decades of his life, almost certainly, working on Rhodes. He is the astronomer who first proposed the eccentric model of the lunar orbit, the model in which the moon's path is offset from the Earth, so that the moon moves faster at one end of its orbit and slower at the other. He worked out the geometry of it, in numbers, in tables. He is, in the histories of astronomy, the first great quantitative observer of the Greek world. And inside the device, embedded in bronze, in the pin sliding in its slot, in the eccentric gear axis, is the physical incarnation of his lunar theory. Whoever cut those gears was either Hipparchus's student or his student's student. The line of descent is not speculative. The geometry of the device only makes sense if you know Hipparchan astronomy. So one picture, the cleanest picture, is this. You are in a workshop in Rhodes, in the 2nd or early 1st century before Christ. The school of Posidonius is up on the slope, the harbour below. A team of craftsmen works under a master mechanic whose name has not survived, building geared bronze instruments for the wealthy and the learned. The mathematics of Hipparchus alive in their hands, the order book full. The device on your table is one of those instruments, made to a standing customer's specification, packed in its wooden box, carried down the white stone steps to the harbour, loaded onto a Roman cargo ship along with statues and amphorae and glass, headed for the table of some senatorial collector in Rome, never to arrive. But there is another picture, quieter, older, harder to prove, but worth sitting with. This is the Syracuse picture. The Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, the same team that decoded the device, noted something curious about the names engraved on its metonic dial. The dial is divided into the months of a Greek calendar. The names are Corinthian. The Corinthian month names on the metonic dial match the names that were used in the city of Syracuse, Syracuse on Sicily, Archimedes' home, the city whose siege Cicero describes. There are other Corinthian colonies that use those month names, so the match is not exclusive, but it is suggestive. And then, in 2014, two scholars, James Evans and Christian Carman, looked very carefully at the eclipse sequence engraved on the Saros spiral. They worked backwards, year by year, through the eclipses recorded in the glyphs, asking when the sequence began. Their answer was 205 before Christ. That is 7 years after the death of Archimedes. If they are right, the design of the device, at minimum its astronomical calibration, dates to a moment just within the lifetime of the people who knew Archimedes personally. The mechanism, on this view, would not be a Rhodian product, of the 1st century. It would be a slightly later descendant of an Archimedean blueprint that was already old by Cicero's time. You should not pick a side. The honest thing, sitting in this room with the wooden box on the table, is to say that the dispute is alive, and that it may always be alive. The Rhodes evidence is strong. The Syracuse evidence is strong. The most likely truth is that the device is the late product of a tradition that ran from Syracuse to Rhodes, from Archimedes to Hipparchus to Posidonius, across 2 centuries, gathering refinement at each step. The bronze in front of you is the surviving twig of a long branch. The rest of the branch has rotted. And this matters because of how the device looks. When you study it closely, you should look at the gears in your imagination for a moment longer. The triangular teeth are standardized. The shaft sizes repeat. The compact nested tubes are an engineering trick that takes practice. The user manual on the door is a manual, not a thesis. It tells you what to do. It assumes you have used one before. The device does not look like a first attempt. It does not look like a one-off. It looks like the seasoned output of a workshop tradition. It looks like a commercial product, and the implication is heavy. There were, almost certainly, others. There were others on shelves in other rooms of other villas, in Rome, in Alexandria, in Pergamon, in Antioch. There were others being commissioned. There were others being repaired. The Antikythera mechanism was not unique. It was simply the one that fell into the sea. This is the part scholars have called, sometimes a little wryly, the lost library hypothesis. Bronze was wealth. Bronze, in the late ancient world, was money in waiting. You should hold that. A device with delicate gears, sitting in a wealthy household after its owner died, would have been a tempting object for any heir or any creditor who needed the metal more than the marvel. Down the centuries, devices like this one would have been broken up, melted down, recast as plates or as buckles or as coinage. The kind of device that requires a knowledgeable maintainer would have decayed quickly once the tradition that maintained it began to thin. The bronze in your hand, on this seabed, in this case in Athens, survived for one reason. It went into the sea before anyone could melt it. And the man who made it, the man or men, you will not get a name. We do not have a name. We have no signature, no maker's mark, no dedication. The thousands of Greek letters that crawl across the door plates are technical, not personal. They name months and cycles and orbital periods. They do not name a craftsman. The device is anonymous. The hands that filed those teeth are unknown. You should sit with that thought. A man whose hands were among the most skilled in the ancient world. A man whose product is one of the most extraordinary objects ever recovered. We do not know his name. We will probably never know his name. Very soon after he set down his tools, whoever he was, the entire tradition he stood in ended. You should sit with that, too. You should hold the closing of this room in your mind. Rhodes fell into Roman dependency. The naval power of the island, the wealthy mercantile class that paid for its astronomers, declined steadily through the 1st century before Christ. The Rhodian school of Posidonius outlived its founder by a generation, and then quietly went out. Syracuse, by then, had been Roman for nearly 200 years. Alexandria's mathematical schools drained slowly through the late Hellenistic period, and then contracted further as the city's fortunes shifted. The Roman Empire absorbed the Greek East, and the Roman Empire was, in its character, an empire of soldiers and administrators and engineers of roads and aqueducts. Not of cosmologists building bronze planetariums. There were Roman astronomers in libraries, doing the calculations. There were not, by all the evidence we have, Roman workshops building geared cosmic machines. The customer base for the kind of high-end commercial product the device represented had thinned, and then it was gone. You can see, in your mind, the long ebb of it. The workshops closed. The teachers died. The apprentices found other trades. The blueprints, if there were blueprints, were stored on papyrus or on wax tablets, both of which decay. The devices themselves were inherited and ignored and finally broken up for the metal. You should hold the picture. A bronze gear, 200 years old, beautifully cut, sitting on the workbench of a smith in 3rd century Rome, going into a crucible. You can see the orange glow. You can see the slow run of liquid bronze into a mold, a buckle, a clasp, a small statue of a household god. The gear is gone. The tradition is gone. The geometry is gone. There is, in the long 1,000-year valley that follows, one quiet survivor. You should hold it in your mind. A small object. A flat brass disc not much larger than a child's hand, made probably in Constantinople, probably in the early 6th century after Christ. We call it the Byzantine sundial calendar of Macarius. It currently sits in the London Science Museum, in a glass case in a side gallery. It is a portable sundial that tells the hour in 16 different cities of the Eastern Roman world. Attached to the back of it is a small geared calendar, 4 gears, that tracks the days of the week and the phases of the moon. It is modest. It is serious. When you stand in front of it, it is a kind of ghost. It is what was left of the tradition, 800 years after the bronze sank off Antikythera. A small reminder that someone, still, around the year 520, somewhere in the Byzantine East, remembered how to cut a gear. The complexity is a fraction. The pin and the slot are gone. The Saros spiral is gone. The phase ball is gone. But the principle, the brass disc behind the brass disc, the slow tooth biting another tooth, is still there. It is the lowest ebb. After it, in the European record, the silence is almost complete for another 500 years. The line did not die. It moved. You should follow it. You should turn east now. In the 9th century, in Baghdad, in the great courts of the Abbasid Caliphate, 3 brothers became famous as the Banu Musa. They translated Greek mechanical treatises into Arabic. They wrote a book of their own devices, the Book of Ingenious Devices, full of clever cisterns and trick fountains and small geared toys. The line of Hellenistic mechanical thought, which had thinned to nothing in the Christian West, ran instead, like a river finding a new bed, through the Arabic-speaking world. In the late 10th century, in 996 after Christ, the Persian polymath al-Biruni, sitting in a study somewhere in Central Asia, described a device he called the Box of the Moon. A small geared astrolabe with 8 gears, tracking the orbits of the Sun and the Moon together, a thinner version of the Antikythera idea, not the full epicyclic glory, not the planets, but the gear train, the bronze tooth biting bronze tooth in the service of astronomy, was alive in his hands. You should hold the next century too. The 12th century, in northern Mesopotamia, the engineer al-Jazari wrote times the Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices, a book of water clocks, automata, geared toys, mechanical servants. The Hellenistic tradition, in the hands of Islamic engineers, refined itself and grew and produced its own marvels. A surviving 13th century Islamic geared astrolabe now sits, calm and small, in the Museum of the History of Science in Oxford. You should hold it in your mind. A small brass disc, rotating subdiscs, Arabic letters around the edge, the gears visible at the back. The line, again, kept alive, not at the density of Antikythera, not the planets, but alive. And then, very slowly, the line wandered back. You should hold the next room in your mind. The early 14th century, an abbey in southern England, in St. Albans. A young man named Richard of Wallingford rises to become abbot. He had studied at Oxford. He had read what he could of the astronomical and mechanical inheritance. He was a serious mathematician for his age, and he was also slowly losing his health to leprosy. You should see him walking in the cloister in the years he could still walk. In the 1320s, in the years he could still work, he began the construction, in the church of his abbey, of an astronomical clock. You should hold the clock in your mind. It was enormous, iron and brass. It told the hour, and it tracked the sun, and the moon, and the lunar nodes, and the rising and setting of stars, and the predictions of eclipses. It was not as compact as the Antikythera mechanism. It was not as elegant. But for the first time in 1500 years, in a Christian European workshop, a device was being built that did, mechanically, what the bronze on the seafloor had done. Wallingford died in 1336, his clock unfinished. It was completed after him. It struck the hour, for a while, in the abbey at St. Albans, until the dissolution of the monasteries broke up the abbey and the clock with it. In the 16th century, like the bronze sphere of Archimedes, it is gone. We have only the manuscripts that describe it. 28 years later, in 1364, in the northern Italian city of Padua, a physician named Giovanni de Dondi unveiled a device of his own. You should hold him too. He called it the Times Astrarium. It had taken him 16 years to build. A tall brass cabinet with 7 faces, each face tracking one of the 7 Ptolemaic bodies, the 5 planets, the sun, the moon. To handle the irregular motion of the planets, de Dondi used pin and slot mechanisms. The same kind of device, in spirit, that the unknown Hellenistic mechanic had used to handle the lunar anomaly 15 centuries before. De Dondi knew nothing of the Antikythera mechanism. The bronze was, at that moment, deep under the silt off the coast of an island most of medieval Europe had never heard of, but the geometry was the same. The geometry had always been the same. The men of Padua were arriving, by their own slow medieval climb, at the place the men of Rhodes or Syracuse had already stood. A point in human craft where you can build a small machine that shows the sky. You should sit, for a moment, with what this tells you. That technical knowledge, the kind that lives in workshops and in hands, in the relationship between a master and an apprentice, is fragile. That it can be invented and held and refined and made beautiful and then lost so completely that nothing remains but a literary mention in a half-surviving Roman book. That 1500 years can sit between one bronze gear and the next that does the same job. That progress is not a line on a graph. It is a tide. It rises and falls and rises again in places no one would have predicted, in hands no one knew about. You should not moralize this. You should not draw a lesson. You should simply hold it. The bronze sat in the silt. The world, above it, forgot. And then, in our own century, the bronze began to give back. Again, things no one had expected. You may remember the long story we have already walked through. The sponge divers in 1900, Valerios Stais, and the gear wheel in 1902. Derek de Solla Price in 1959, with his title for the Times Scientific American Times article, an ancient Greek computer, Karakalos, with his gamma rays, Wright with his linear tomography and his spirals. The Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, arriving in Athens in 2005 with the 8-ton micro-CT scanner from a company called X-Tech. The 2006 paper in Times Nature, the slow, decade-long expansion of what could be read on the bronze. By the late 2010s, the back face of the device was well understood: the Metonic spiral, the Callippic dial, the Olympiad dial, the Saros spiral, the Exeligmos dial, the pin and slot mechanism for the lunar anomaly. All of that was settled. What remained, what would not let the researchers sleep, was the front. The front face, with its zodiac and its calendar, and its sun pointer, and its moon pointer, and its phase ball, was reasonably well mapped. But the surviving inscriptions on the back and on the doors mentioned the planets. They named Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. They gave orbital periods for each one. The device was clearly designed, in its original form, to show the positions of all 5 planets on its front face. But the physical gears for those planetary displays were not in the surviving fragments. Either they had been lost in the wreck, scattered into the silt, or they had been in a part of the case that was destroyed. The front face, as we had it, was a face with a hole in the middle. You should hold the date. March of 2021. A paper appeared in Times Scientific Reports, the open access wing of Times Nature. You should hold the writers of it in your mind. The lead author was Tony Freeth, the mathematician who had been part of the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project from the beginning. The second author was a materials engineer at University College London named Adam Wojcik. Their paper proposed a complete reconstruction of the missing planetary display. Their starting point was the inscriptions themselves. On the back of the device, in the small Greek lettering revealed by the CT scans, the inscriptions had given orbital periods for the planets. Some of these periods were strange numbers. The number for Venus was a 462-year cycle. The number for Saturn was a 442-year cycle. You should sit with those, briefly. They are not the obvious numbers a Hellenistic astronomer would reach for by the standard methods. They are very specific. Freeth and Wojcik looked at where those numbers could have come from, and they found, sitting in the literature of pre-Socratic Greek philosophy, the answer. They came from the cycles described by Parmenides of Elea in the 5th century before Christ, in mathematical theories about planetary motion that had survived in fragments and in references in later authors. The device, in other words, was using astronomical cycles that drew on a philosophical tradition older than Aristotle, older than Hipparchus, older than the device itself by some 4 centuries. You should picture what they did next. The UCL team built, digitally, a gear train that would have produced those cycles in the compact space available inside the front of the case, 25 millimeters, about the depth of a finger from the knuckle to the nail. Into that 25 millimeters, they had to fit a nested tube mechanism that drove 5 concentric pointers, each running at the correct planetary speed, each handling the loops and reverses that the geocentric model required. They modeled it, they printed parts, they built a working physical version. The model accounted for almost every previously unexplained surviving gear. The 63-tooth gear in fragment D, which had sat for years without a clear function, slotted in. The new model proposed that the planets, on the front face, were represented by small beads of semi-precious stone riding on concentric rings lapis lazuli for one, turquoise, carnelian, jasper, jade, a pale, jewel-colored cosmos on the bronze face, Mercury close to the Sunday, Venus a little further out, Mars beyond, Jupiter further still, Saturn at the outer edge. All of them turning, when the side crank turned, at the rates that Parmenides and Hipparchus and the long Greek tradition had decided the planets must turn. You should hold the picture. The case is in your hands. A bronze door, open. Behind the door, a face, 2 concentric calendar rings, the zodiac and the Egyptian months. 2 long pointers, one for the sun, one for the moon, with the phase ball halfway along the lunar arm, and around them, on 5 thin concentric rings, 5 small jewel beads riding on tracks, set into the surface, a deep blue bead for Mercury, very close to the Sunday, a pale green bead for Venus, a dull red bead for Mars, a pale yellow bead for Jupiter, a deeper, older yellow bead for Saturn. At the outer edge, when you turn the crank, the whole face comes alive. The sun pointer creeps, the moon pointer races, the phase ball rolls, and the 5 small beads slide, each in their own ring, around their own little tracks, in their own retrograde loops, doing the small backwards dance that planets in a geocentric model are required to do. The UCL reconstruction does not prove this is how it was. The physical evidence is still buried somewhere in the silt of the Antikythera channel, or scattered, or gone, but it is the most coherent picture you have. It uses every surviving inscription. It uses every surviving gear. It fits in the 25 millimeters of space. It works. What you still do not know is large. We do not know if the team is right about Parmenides. We do not know exactly where the planetary gears went. We do not know how many other devices like this existed in the Hellenistic Mediterranean. We do not know the maker. We do not know whether any of the 82 surviving fragments, when scanned with imaging technology that has not been invented yet, will tell us something else. Something we have not guessed at. The device is still working on us. It is still giving up new information, slowly, decade by decade. Whatever you know about it today is not the last thing that will be known. You should walk, in your mind, through the museum, one more time, the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, a large neoclassical building on Petition Street. Wide stone steps, you climb them. Inside, after the entrance hall, the long galleries of marble, Koroi, the bronze Poseidon, lifting his arm to throw. Long rooms, cool, with high ceilings. You hear the slow tread of school groups. You hear the murmur of the curators. You watch the slant of the late afternoon light through the tall windows. You walk through the rooms with the bronzes from the Antikythera wreck. The Antikythera youth, his hand outstretched, holding nothing now, his bronze skin green and dark. The philosopher, an older man, bearded, looking out and a little down. A marble Hermes, half finished, the relics of a Roman cargo paraded 2,000 years after they fell, and then, off to the side, in a smaller gallery, you find the case. A simple case, in a corner, with low light, with a label in Greek and in English. Behind the glass, on a small mount, sits fragment A, the largest of the surviving pieces of the mechanism, about the size of a small shoebox, heavy, calcified, green bronze, dark, the color of moss on a sea cliff. You can see, if you look, the curve of the largest gear visible on the surface. You can see the triangular teeth, blunted by 2,000 years of salt. You can see the edge of a dial. You can see the faint impression of a Greek letter, almost lost. The label tells you it is the Antikythera mechanism. The label tells you it is an analog computer of the 2nd century before Christ. The label is dry. The lump behind the glass is dry. The room is quiet. A child stands beside you, looking through the glass. The child does not see what you have seen in the last 2 hours. The child sees only a small, lumpish, green-brown object in a small case, in a quiet room. There are many cases. There are many objects. The child will move on, in a moment, to the next gallery. But the object will go on doing what it does. You should let it. It will sit there, in its climate-controlled case, in that quiet corner. The lights will go off at night, and the room will be very dark, and somewhere in Athens, a curator will lock a door and walk home, and the bronze will sit alone. The moon, outside that locked door, will rise and set, exactly as it always has. The sun, the next morning, will creep through the zodiac at the same imperceptible pace at which it crept while Hipparchus watched it from Rhodes. The Saros cycle will continue its slow 18-year repetition. An eclipse will arrive, on time, in the year 2050, on a date the device, if it were still cranking, would have shown in a small cell on the lower back spiral. You should hold the picture, a Saros glyph on a spiral, a real sun in a real sky, 24 years from your tonight, going dim on schedule. The bronze is older. The bronze is in fragments, but the equations are the same. You should hold that last thought. The Antikythera mechanism is not, in any practical sense, a working machine anymore. It is a corroded lump in a case in Athens. It is 82 fragments. It will never tell anyone the time again. The sun pointer will not move. The moon pointer will not race. The phase ball will not roll. The Saros cell will not slide into its window. The crank will not turn. The bronze, in its real and physical existence, has retired from the work it was made to do. And yet, the sky is the same sky. The moon does the same dance. The planets, in their long retrograde slow loops, follow the same paths that the small jewel beads on the front face would have followed. The eclipses arrive in the same 19-year and 18-year and 54-year patterns that the device tracked. The geometry has not changed. The geometry was never the property of the bronze. You should hold that one carefully. The bronze was only ever a small place where the geometry was made visible, where a man could turn a knob and see, in miniature, the running of the heavens. Other men, in other centuries, have made that geometry visible in other ways. Wallingford, in his Abbey, de Dondi, in Padua, Tony Freeth, in his model in London. You, tonight, lying in the dark, with the device described to you over the course of 2 hours, can hold the geometry, too. It is in the room with you. You should let your thoughts walk one last slow loop, from the sponge diver, in his copper helmet, sinking into the dark, from Valerios Stais, in the museum courtyard, lifting a small lump and seeing, on its surface, a gear, from Derek de Solla Price, at Yale, with his gamma rays, from the team in Athens, in 2005, with the green letters glowing on their monitor for the first time, from Tony Freeth in 2021, with his model of the planets in their concentric rings, from Cicero in his villa writing about Archimedes by lamplight, from Posidonius on Rhodes in the long afternoon, from Hipparchus watching the moon move at its uneven pace and writing down its numbers, from an unknown craftsman in some workshop we will never find, bending his head over a small wheel with a fine file in his hand and filing a single triangular tooth into shape, and another, until the device was finished. From him to the wreck, from the wreck to the bottom, from the bottom to the diver, from the diver to the museum, from the museum to your room, tonight, in the dark, with the slow voice of this telling and the long arrival, finally, at silence. The bronze is in the case at Athens. The moon is doing the same dance. The geometry is unchanged. Sleep now,